History is made of things that survived. The documents, the photographs, the recordings, the physical objects that were kept rather than lost, that were preserved rather than discarded, that passed through time intact and arrived in the present as evidence. We know what we know about the past because certain things survived it. And what we do not know, what remains permanently beyond reach, is determined equally by what was lost. The letters that burned, the recordings that degraded, the small paper objects that were swept from surfaces and put in bins and became nothing, without anyone understanding at the moment of their disposal that they were removing something from the record of the world. In 1957, a 15-year-old boy named Paul McCartney sent a telegram to a 16-year-old boy named John Lennon. The telegram was brief, it was handwritten, or typed. The accounts differ, and it was about music, about the afternoon that had just happened, the church fete in Woolton, the makeshift stage, the skiffle group called the Quarrymen, the performance that Paul had watched from the edge of the crowd with the careful, quiet attention of someone who notices things and files them. It was about the chord shapes he had demonstrated afterward in the back room, when the two of them had sat with their guitars and Paul had shown John things he did not know, and John had watched Paul's hands and learned them, and something had passed between them that neither of them had language for yet. The telegram said something. It said enough that John saved it, held it for some days, kept it in the way that young people keep things that feel significant before they have learned to be unsentimental about significance. He kept it. Through that summer, he kept it into the autumn, and then Aunt Mimi found it. Mimi, practical, unsentimental, constitutionally resistant to the romanticization of anything connected to music, which she had spent years regarding as a pleasant distraction at best and a catastrophic waste of a promising young man's potential at worst, swept it from the surface where John had left it. She did not know it was important. She could not have known. She put it with other papers, and the other papers went out, and the telegram went with them. And by the time John noticed it was gone completely, no retrieval possible, no recovery available, no way to reconstruct exactly what it had said. When he discovered what Mimi had done, he said nothing to her. He came to dinner that evening and ate what she had made and was quieter than usual, which she may or may not have attributed to the telegram, and then he went to his room, and he did not speak about it for a long time, did not mention it in any interview or conversation that was later documented, did not include it in any account of how the partnership had begun. It was gone. The beginning was gone. What remained was everything the beginning had made possible, and that, it turns out, was enough to change the world. John Winston Lennon was 16 years old in the summer of 1957, and he was already, by every available measure, someone for whom the ordinary trajectory of a life was not going to be sufficient. He had grown up in Mendips, the semi-detached house on Menlove Avenue in Liverpool that his Aunt Mimi kept with the particular combination of warmth and firm propriety that defined her approach to everything. Mimi loved him. This was not in question, had never been in question, whatever the complexity of her feelings about the choices he was making and the direction his life seemed determined to take. She had taken him in when his parents' marriage dissolved and his father Freddie disappeared into the maritime world, and his mother Julia was deemed too unconventional to be the primary custodian of a small child. She had provided stability and structure and decent meals and an education that she hoped would lead somewhere respectable. John had appreciated the stability more than he had shown and resisted the respectability with everything he had. The guitar had arrived in his life through Julia, who came and went, who was the warm, laughing, impulsive counterforce to Mimi's order, who played banjo and sang and let young John stay up too late and introduced him to the music that was coming over from America. On Radio Luxembourg and the early rock and roll records that sounded like a different world being transmitted through a small speaker on a shelf, Julia had taught him his first chord shapes. She had given him the instrument, a cheap acoustic, unimpressive in every material sense, but the first object that had ever felt in John's hands like a tool rather than a toy, something he could use to make something. He formed the Quarrymen in 1956. They were a skiffle group, the British youth music form of the mid-1950s, combining American folk and blues with improvised instrumentation, played at the speed of teenage energy on whatever instruments were available and affordable. John was the leader by instinct and by the simple fact that the band existed because he had willed it into existence. He played banjo first, then guitar. He sang with the quality that would define his voice for the rest of his life, not technically polished, not trained in any conventional sense, but unmistakably present, the voice of someone for whom the sound was coming from somewhere real rather than being produced from somewhere calculated. The Quarrymen played church halls and youth clubs and the occasional outdoor event. They were inconsistent, as 16-year-old bands are inconsistent, brilliant in moments, ragged in others, held together by enthusiasm and John's particular force of personality more than by any sustained collective competence. But there were moments when something happened that was beyond inconsistency. Moments when the sound aligned and the feeling behind it found the right channel, and something came through the performance that had not been engineered but had simply arrived. John knew the difference between those moments and the others. He was already at 16, developing the internal instrument that would eventually lead him to smash a recording of his own voice in an empty room 9 years later because it failed to meet the standard that those moments had established. The standard was already there. He could already hear when something was true and when it was not, and the gap between the two was the primary driver of everything he would spend the rest of his life making. The fate at St. Peter's Church in Woolton on July 6, 1957, was not an exceptional occasion in any external sense. It was a summer church garden party, the kind of event that Liverpool's suburban parishes organized annually, with stalls and games and local entertainment and the comfortable communal atmosphere of a neighborhood gathering around familiar rituals. The Quarrymen were on the bill. Because someone knew someone, because John had pursued the booking with the persistence that characterized all his early efforts to get his band in front of audiences. He performed with the particular quality of someone who has decided that every performance matters and has not yet been worn down by enough performances to doubt that decision. He played into the afternoon heat with total commitment, and the crowd watched with the pleasant, partial attention that summer garden parties give to their entertainment, and Paul McCartney stood at the edge of it all and listened with the other kind of attention entirely. James Paul McCartney was 15 years old. He had come to the fete with a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan, who knew people in the Quarrymen and had suggested, in the casual way that the significant things are usually suggested, that Paul might want to come along. Paul had been making music on his own for 2 years. His mother, Mary McCartney, had died of breast cancer in October 1956, when Paul was 14, a loss that had reorganized his interior life in ways that would eventually find their way into his music, though not yet, not in 1957, when the loss was still too recent and too large to be approached directly. He had turned toward music in the aftermath of his mother's death with the specific intensity of someone who needs somewhere for the grief to go, and the music had received it in the way that music receives things when it is being used for the right purpose. He had written songs, not many and not sophisticated, but genuinely his own, the impulse to make rather than consume, to produce rather than receive, arriving early and with force. He played piano, then guitar, with the methodical precision that was already a defining quality of his musical mind, the desire to understand how the thing worked, to learn the mechanics fully, to know not just what sounded right, but why. Where John's approach to music was instinctive and visceral and occasionally technically approximate, Paul's was careful and precise and structurally grounded, the qualities that would make their eventual partnership so generative, because the two approaches would friction against each other in ways that produced things neither could have made alone. He watched the Quarrymen from the edge of the crowd, and he heard what John was doing, and he knew, with the quiet, certain knowledge of someone whose musical ear had been trained to a specific standard, that John was doing something real, imperfect in places, technically improvable, but real in the way that mattered, real in the way that no amount of technique without the underlying truth can replicate. He also knew, watching, that he could contribute something, not replace what was there. He was not that kind of person, did not operate through displacement, but add to it. The chord shapes he knew that John did not. The melodic precision he could bring to the harmonic instinct that John already had. He could see the gap between what the Quarrymen were and what they could be, and he could see his own potential place in that gap. After the performance, Ivan made the introduction. John watched Paul's hands on the guitar with the complete, unguarded attention that he brought to anything he wanted to learn. Paul demonstrated. John absorbed. The chord shapes passed between them information, technique, the specific physical knowledge of how to place fingers on strings to produce sounds. That served the music. It took perhaps 15 minutes. By the end of those 15 minutes, both of them knew something that had not been true at the beginning of them. The world was about to change, not dramatically, not yet, but the thing that would change it had just been set in motion in a back room in Woolton, between two boys with guitars who had just discovered that they were more interesting together than they were apart. Paul went home. He sat at the kitchen table across from his father, Jim McCartney, who was a jazz musician and a practical man, and someone who understood from his own experience that music was both the most important thing in the world and an extremely unreliable way of sustaining a life. Jim looked at his son's face and recognized the expression on it, the expression of someone who has just encountered something that has reorganized their understanding of what is possible, and he said nothing that evening, which was its own kind of permission. Paul wrote the telegram. What it said exactly has been lost. This is not a figure of speech or a narrative convenience. The telegram is gone, swept from a surface in a house on Menlove Avenue, by a woman who had no way of knowing that the small paper object she was discarding was the beginning of something, the first written communication between two people who would go on to build the most consequential creative partnership in the history of popular music. What survives is not the telegram, but its effects. The fact that John received it and kept it for some days rather than dismissing it. The fact that Paul was invited to join the Quarrymen, an invitation that was not immediate, that took John several weeks to extend, during which the telegram and the memory of the afternoon in the back room and the specific quality of Paul's musical intelligence as John had experienced it in those 15 minutes were all present in his thinking, being weighed against the risk that bringing in someone this capable might disrupt the fragile authority structure of the band. John decided the risk was worth it. He extended the invitation. Paul accepted. And the thing that the telegram had set in motion became the thing that would define the second half of the 20th century's popular culture. The years between that invitation and the moment when the Beatles became what they became are a story that has been told many times and will be told many more. The Hamburg years, the Cavern Club, the Brian Epstein signing, the EMI audition, the recordings that began in 1962 and that would produce over the following 8 years, a body of music that has not been equaled in its combination of reach, ambition, and emotional truth. At the center of that music was the songwriting partnership between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Not the only creative force at work, George Harrison's contributions were substantial and increasingly independent, and the band's collaborative dynamic was more complex than any simple partnership model can contain. But the engine, the primary generative force, the thing that produced the songs that the world has not been able to finish with for more than 60 years, was the two of them together. They wrote differently together than they wrote alone. The differences in their musical minds, the differences that had been visible in that Woolton back room, John's instinct against Paul's precision, John's willingness to leave the rough edge if the edge was true against Paul's drive to perfect the surface, did not disappear in collaboration. They intensified. They created a productive friction, a mutual pressure that pushed each of them beyond what either could reach independently. John made Paul more willing to take risks with emotional directness. Paul made John more willing to care about the craft of a song as a made object, something that could be refined and improved rather than simply expressed and accepted in whatever form it arrived. The songs that came from this friction are among the most durable artifacts of 20th century culture, not because of what they represent, not because of their cultural significance or their historical importance, but because of what they do when you hear them, because of the specific quality of something that has been made by two people whose differences were generative rather than destructive, whose friction produced heat rather than damage, whose collaboration was the productive meeting of two incomplete but complementary musical intelligences. Mimi never knew what the telegram said. John never told her. This was consistent with how John handled most of the things that cost him. He did not make scenes, did not confront, did not deliver the accounting of what the other person's actions had produced. He absorbed, he converted. He went to dinner and ate what was made and was quieter than usual and then went to his room and continued being who he was going to be regardless. The partnership did not require the telegram. It had already happened in the back room in the 15 minutes in the chord shapes that passed between them. The telegram was a record of something that was already real. Its loss did not undo what was real, it only removed the evidence. And perhaps that is the more interesting version of the story anyway, the version in which the beginning of the greatest musical partnership of the century is not documented, in which what survives is not the communication but the thing that the communication set in motion, in which the record is gone and only the music remains, enormous, enduring, utterly indifferent to whether the small paper object that preceded it survived or was swept from a surface by a woman who was cleaning and did not know. Mimi lived until 1991. She was 98 years old. She had spent the decades of John's fame with a complicated mixture of pride and the residual stubbornness of someone who had spent years insisting that the guitar was very nice but would never pay the rent and had been spectacularly, comprehensively wrong. She spoke about John in the later years of her life with a love that was real and a specificity that only long proximity produces. She remembered the boy on Menlove Avenue with his guitar and his quick mouth and his refusal to take the practical path. She did not remember the telegram, or if she remembered it, she did not know it was what it was, did not connect the small paper object she had discarded with the partnership that it had preceded. John never told her. He went to dinner and was quieter than usual and then let it go, which is a form of grace that he did not often receive credit for, being more associated in the public imagination with sharpness and directness than with the quieter kindnesses. Paul McCartney has spoken, across the decades, about the partnership with John in the way that people speak about something they cannot fully account for and have stopped trying to account for, with a combination of love and bewilderment and the specific grief of someone mourning a person they never finished knowing. He has spoken about the songs as the product of something he cannot fully explain, which is the most honest thing you can say about a collaboration that worked as well as theirs did. He does not know, any more than anyone else does, exactly what the telegram said. What he knows is what was said afterward, in the studios, in the late nights, in the long hours of two people sitting with guitars and finding the things that neither could have found without the other. That conversation lasted 12 years. It produced some of the most extraordinary music the world has heard. It began in a back room in Woolton, with 15 minutes and a chord shape and the specific quality of two musical intelligences recognizing each other, and it was preceded by a day or two by a small paper object that a boy kept for some weeks and then lost to the ordinary domestic entropy of a house in Liverpool, and that has never been found, and that contained, in whatever words a 15-year-old chose on the afternoon of July 6, 1957, the first written record of a beginning that changed everything. Gone, completely, irretrievably gone. And everything it pointed toward still playing. What does a lost beginning mean for the thing it began? And what does it say about how history works, that the evidence of the first moment can disappear while the moment itself echoes forward through decades of music that billions of people have heard and will keep hearing? The telegram is gone, the music is not. The beginning was always in the music. It still was.